Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Luke Reacts. And this is going to be an amazing one. We have so much fun together. But before I get to introducing my guest, let me remind you to please like and subscribe to our channel. It is very cool. We have lots of interesting conversations all the time there. And we did cross the line to over 25,000 subscribers. So obviously the next line to meet is 30. Right? Isn't that, you got to go up in increments of 5,000. So with me today is two colleagues of mine. We have Simone, who is the director of Philos Catholic, and we have Phil, who is the strategic advisor for the Philos Project. And the two of them, actually, the three of us, I mean, we could title this a Protestant, a Jew, and a Catholic walk into a bar, but there's no bar. So we're going to walk into a podcast studio and have a conversation about actually something rather, sad in a way, but also interesting to humanity, which is the death of Pope Francis. And so just a little bit on Pope Francis. He passed away on April 21st. At the age of 88. He had been sick for a bit, and it was I think it was a surprise, but also not a surprise. And so first, Simone, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, what was your immediate reaction on the death of Pope Francis, and how are people in your community around you kind of thinking and talking about him?
Yeah, I think my immediate reaction was good timing, Holy Father, because he died on Easter Monday, which, so he got to say his last, farewell, I think on Easter, our most important holiday. So passing away on Easter Monday was well timed. Yeah, that was my first actual thought.
It's a good thought.
It is. I just, there's a lot of planning that goes into Vatican Easter celebrations, and it just really would have complicated things.
There's a joke there. It takes a lot out of a man, but maybe that's too soon.
Yeah. I think that, in my community, there's like a whole range of reactions. There are those who are really going to miss him, and everyone's posting on their social media. It's like pictures of when they met him and really appreciated many parts of his papacy. Others are more complicated, sense of relief, actually, because of a lot of the controversial, divisive, decisions that were made during his fairly short papacy. So there's, in my community, a whole range of reactions, and everyone, of course, praying for the repose of his soul. And, it's always when the Pope dies, it was a profound moment of self-reflection, memento mori, remember your own death, and just curiosity, I think, for who the next Holy Father will be and the direction that the church will take, depending on who gets elected. So that is, a conclave is always an exciting time for Catholics, and I think for non-Catholics too. As
yeah, we're all a little bit, kind of excited. I don't know. Excited is not the right word. Perhaps I'm too positive about all this more than I should be, but I do think there's a lot of anticipation about the coming conclave, not the movie, but the actual one. Let me jump to you, Phil, and I would love to hear, as a non-Christian Orthodox Jewish guy who has now spent several months with us Christians, kind of talking about all things Christian and Jewish relations, and what the heck's up with this and that. What are your thoughts? How is this? I'm not sure many in your community are super chatty about Pope Francis' death, but maybe they are. But what are your thoughts on, and perhaps an immediate reaction? In general, what are your thoughts?
I will say that the most immediate reaction actually was friends reaching out to me, as probably one of the only friends that they have who was working in the Christian space. Plenty of friends reached out to me asking what all of you guys thought about the passing of Pope Francis. I think I, at least instinctively, realize that this is a very profound moment for Catholics around the world. It is a solemn moment, and that is true regardless of, as Simone mentioned, the controversies and the positions he took throughout his papacy. I think what a lot of Jews are now realizing, certainly I'm realizing this now, reading all of the reflections about Pope Francis's papacy, is just how intertwined the Vatican is with culture and politics across the world, and how so much of the post-mortem reflections that I'm reading are about that mix, and how any new pope will attack that interesting mix that the Pope sits atop of. So that's, I think, where I'm at now, and I'm just trying to read as many reflections as I can to see what people are thinking and how people are thinking about the future of the church.
So I'm curious. I'd love to go kind of right at where you guys were talking about. What do you think, if you were to kind of like summarize the legacy of Pope Francis, what do you think he will be remembered for specifically? Is there? I mean, it's obviously a controversial time. Every pope, though, has to deal with the controversies of the time in which they live, and I'm sure there are so many. Like the issues are always shifting, but how do you think, what will be the remembered legacy of Pope Francis, Simone?
Well, okay. Let me see if I can answer this without being too convoluted. I would say that I don't know that there necessarily will be this massive legacy. There's a lot of popes in history. So I don't know, will he be ones that are, I mean, and popes in the past have done very important and significant things that had never been done before, but they have largely been forgotten. We have a long history. But in maybe in the immediate future, from where I'm standing, I mean, this is the via negativa, because of my experience of Pope Francis as an educator. My hope is that this is going to sound so negative, but that there's this need for clarity in evangelizing the gospel, and clarity when it comes to truth, and that ambiguity and confusion is not helpful. That's my bias. Obviously, that's from where I'm standing. I think on a more positive end, there are many things that people have really appreciated. I would say that a lot of my non-Catholic friends and non-Catholic Christian friends, even Orthodox friends, really appreciated how down to earth Pope Francis is, how very pastoral, very, the way that he would show a lot of mercy and compassion. I think on a positive end, mercy would be what he is most remembered for. I think that's his papal motto, and hugging the disabled man, comforting that little boy who was worried about his atheist father going to hell. Those kind of things, I think, on a positive end, are what Pope Francis will be remembered for. You have to smell like the sheep. You have to get out to the peripheries. I've quoted Pope Francis in my talks ad nauseum about existential orphanhood, this epidemic of loneliness. To me, the contributions that Francis made in my life, those are the positive things that I will take with me from his papacy.
Phil, you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll say, as an outsider to this, to this entire story, I think, Pope Francis came after two real giants in the church, intellectual giants that were John Paul II and Pope Benedict. And those are hard shoes to fill. And I think, again, I don't know, of course, the space that well. I don't know who else was up for consideration. But it's hard to imagine that there would have been anyone that really would have followed in a similar legacy to the two popes that preceded Pope Francis. And I think, I think I was going to say right off the bat, his care for the poor, for the less fortunate, is something that I've always followed Pope Francis. That video, like you said, Simone, of him comforting that boy has always really meant a lot to me. Frankly, it's a really special clip. But yeah, I think a lot of the questions surrounding the traditional Latin Mass and communion and giving communion to Nancy Pelosi, I think those things, are going to be, those things are going to occupy large chapters in the books that people will write about Pope Francis, and that will make like any public figure, for a complicated legacy.
Yeah, I was thinking about this as well, and you guys are way more positive than me, because I think for me it's like, I'm not Catholic, I'm a Protestant, um, and I it's the going after conservatives that seems to be that's unfortunately the legacy that I'm going to remember. Obviously, the popes are. I mean, they do have they have a pedagogical role in society broadly, but more specifically to the church itself. And I often saw this strange kind of, I have several friends who became Catholics, like, Catholic converts, and some went like are proper zealots. I mean, geez, the stuff they say just, ooh, okay, is a lot.
What do they
Way
say?
more than, well, I mean, the penance stuff, and you got to go, they're all in on the Mary stuff. It's like a lot. And so they came in, but I'm like, yeah, but Pope Francis is not quite as like hard line as you are. How do you score that? Like, how do you make that work? Because I mean, he went right at the Latin Mass. And when I'm talking to particularly young converts or young people that are like really interested and passionate about Catholicism, the thing that they love the most is that tradition. And like, the more tradition, the better. The more fasting, the more it takes on a very like, it requires a liturgical life in the almost in the way that Orthodox Judaism requires a liturgical life. And I mean liturgical, and the word liturgical there for me is, what I'm saying is, it's like you have a ritual of life that carries you through the day, through the week, through the year, with fasts and holidays and expectations on you. I mean, how many times have you prayed today, Phil? Right? Like, you got up this morning and got with a bunch of other people and prayed. And right, like, that's the kind of thing that I think a lot of, particularly the young, it's why we're seeing this increase of young people come into traditional liturgical churches, because they're craving that kind of thing. And Phil, you, like, the Jews just don't want to convert anybody, so we're like stopping at the Catholics or the Orthodox, right? But I think what you get is this, like, what comes to mind so quickly to me is this kind of going at the conservatives within the church, but that's the place where the church is growing the fastest, right? So my sense is, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is that a conservative pope, if at the end of the conclave, however that unpacks, that the next pope is conservative in the, I don't know, the traditionally conservative ways, meaning like Pope Francis was still like pro-life. He was still very clear on human sexuality, but pastorally merciful in a sense, right? And so, but if the next pope is very much more kind of clear on that stuff, I could see there being this, just like the increase of Catholics really takes off. I mean, just already taking off, but it's like nitrous oxide in an engine, right? Like, I'd love to get your take on all that ran in my mind for a few seconds.
It's always interesting to hear from a non-Catholic Christian perspective what it looks like on the outside, because I would say that, well, of course, I lament that there are any labels at all conservative, and there are, and they are helpful when we talk about things to understand where people land in the church. But one of the reasons I became a Catholic in my adult life is because I didn't want to have to adhere to conservative Christianity or liberal Christianity or moderate Christianity as if it depended on where my politics were or where my doctrinal beliefs were. To be Catholic is to be pro-life. It is to be against same-sex marriage. It is to, I mean, this is what it means to be Catholic. I would say what it means to be a Christian. But so there's wherever the Pope as a person, as a man, lands in his heart, in his soul, in his relation with God is one thing. But as Pope, as universal shepherd of the church, like those are non-negotiable things, which is why I think it made a lot of liberals in the church upset when he had that interview. And can there be women priests? No. Will there be gay marriages? No. He went to a pro-life rally in Rome. Absolutely. So it's just interesting to hear you speak like that, because he made a lot of liberals mad, because liberals can sometimes think that the Catholic Church's doctrines are up for debate. The gospel isn't up for debate. Mm-hmm. Same with the conservatives. The problem is a little bit different. It's still an ecclesiology problem. Like, what is the church problem? Because, with conservatives, you don't really have those debates when it comes to like the life issues, the marriage issues, the sexuality issues. But what's interesting with the liturgy debate to me is that the fact that the document, which ended up in certain dioceses limiting the traditional Latin Mass, was actually a more conservative thing to do, in the sense that he took away his papal power, you could so to speak, and said that it would be up to the bishops to decide whether they can do the Tridentine Mass or not. That's actually more conservative in a certain sense. It's only very much in modern times that we know what the Pope is up to, and that lay people have opinions on social media about the Pope, and we know what's going on in Rome. But that's kind of a modern papacy thing. You could say it started with John the 23rd in some sense, who kind of shifted papal vibes. But in the Eastern Orthodox and Eastern Catholic realm, the bishop, you will always refer more to your personal bishop, to your priest, than you would the Pope. So in the one sense, you're right. Like, it seemed it had the effect of like critiquing these communities, these traditional Catholic communities who love the TLM Mass, which is growing, and you're absolutely right on the demographics, Luke. On the other hand, giving the bishop more jurisdiction over his diocese is actually a technically more historical and conservative thing to do. Hope that makes sense.
No, it does. But I guess it basically then highlights where the different bishops were at, because in some it was like it was just outright, banned is not, banned might be a strong word, but it seemed like as an outsider, it sure looked like what it looked like. Yeah. So I guess, it's very interesting to me that you have this, that you framed it in those terms. And that's the thing that I don't fully get, actually, and how these things play out. Because the way I would often describe the church, if you will, is, the Protestant church is like I describe it as it's like a subdivision with a bunch of houses, right? So, and the houses, each house is like a church or denomination, whereas the Catholic Church is a house with a lot of rooms, right? Because you got the Jesuits, who are kind of seen as like the progressives, and then you got the guys. Who's the dudes with the like habits, where they're all like they have the robes and the rope around their.
Oh, you mean like white robes, or are they brown?
No,
robes?
They're brown robes. Who are those?
Franciscans.
The Franciscans. Those guys are like, whoa, they're all in. And then the nuns with habits, the nuns without habits. It's all, it seems like you got all that in the church, right? So, perhaps it's, again, it's growing in some areas and shrinking in others, but it's,
it's definitely growing in the traditional. I mean, you're right about that. And I think that's because it's a reaction to culture too. And, right. And I think Francis is right about this. There's an epidemic of loneliness. Mother Teresa and Pope John Paul II were and Mother Teresa didn't want to come to the United States. And when she came, she said that this was the poorest country in the world because it suffers from the poverty of loneliness, which is the worst suffering, So I think that this cultural fragmentation, this religious fragmentation that we're seeing, this high secularism, freedom as not about virtue, but about license. That's just not resonating with young people anymore, because you're actually made for truth. You're made for authentic freedom, and you're made for religion. You're made for binding yourself to someone and to God. And so it's not surprising that the tides are shifting to the other extreme. They want beauty, they want order, they want rules, they want the good life and all that has to do with it. But I think what's dangerous about that is that this is still like, if you're Catholic and you believe the church is the church that Jesus founded, right? And the Orthodox and the body of Christ, that Protestants are included in that. We can go into that later if you want, but that you don't get to decide. If you're conservative and you're holding to traditional teachings of the church, which you ought to, as any Catholic, liberal or conservative, that still doesn't mean that you get to be the authority. And I think that's the danger of the problems in circles that tend to more traditional and conservative, is that they still want the church as they want it, right? Am I conservative because the church is teaching true dogma and doctrine, or am I conservative because the church in this moment happens to agree with my politics? That's, is this about the body of Christ, or is this about fitting the church into my social service organization of choice, or my political system of choice? Am I contorting the face of Jesus to the environment, to feminism, to whatever I want, and trying to make him fit into me instead of conforming to him? So I think both extremes have a problem.
Luke, if I could
oh yeah, go for it.
No, one of the things that I was going to add is something that was very new to me, being in this space and interacting with young Catholics, as I've been co-opted by the Philos Catholic team, is I was quite surprised to see, this rise of young, especially American men, going into the Catholic Church, and yet not really caring or following what Pope Francis is doing and what the church is doing. And that was very surprising to me. I mean, I would have thought, this is your guy. Why aren't you paying attention to what he's doing? And I think part of that must come from this dissonance of, yes, I am a Catholic and I'm part of the Catholic Church, and Pope Francis is the head of the Catholic Church. Nevertheless, because of all of these, political issues and all of these hot button conservative issues, we actually don't pay much attention to him. I'll give you an example. Luke, you had that op-ed in Christian Post, I think it was, when the Vatican had Jesus wrapped in a keffiyeh. Right. I don't think, outside of people who work at Philos, I didn't speak to a single young Catholic person who even knew that took place. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I was shocked, because here the Orthodox Jew, knows about this happening. And I think that I actually do wonder whether or not a sign of the times in the next papacy will be whether or not young Catholics actually know the name. And of course, I mean that, more than just literally knowing the name, but actually know who the Pope is, because this new Pope actually can meet the rise of these young men, especially into the church, where they're at and where the moment is. It almost seems to me as if Pope Francis was a Pope for the older generation, for the old guard. And that's why all of the essays that I've been reading since Monday are, people who really represent the old guard of the Catholic Church. And I'm so curious to see whether or not a new Pope meets the young moment that we're in.
So
no, I totally think that's the case. I think it will really depend though on what kind, obviously the next Pope is going to have to deal with the same issues that Pope Francis did. He's still going to have to deal with the issue of abortion, the issue of human sexuality, and by that I mean everything from cohabitating unmarried couples all the way up to the trans conversation, all of that through and through. Chemical birth control is never stops being an issue to some degree. And then, I mean, I'm sure there are many things that the Pope wrote to the bishops in the United States about, but he was super critical of, Donald Trump, adding, being so insistent on deporting illegal immigrants, that kind of the immigration debate. And the immigration debate is not just an American issue, but it's the reason that Maloney in Italy perhaps won. It's the reason that, Urban in Hungary is doing well. It's the reason that Geert Wilders in the Netherlands won. Like it's an issue in Europe too. And so that's going to be an issue. And how the next pope comes down on each of those, I think will continue to shape the pace in which the church continues to grow or shrink.
Yeah, I would say it's interesting, those issues you brought up, because in my mind, the sure, on a pastoral level, like every father has to teach his kids, abortion's evil and wrong. But it's not that the debate is up for whether that doctrinally or dogmatically can change. It cannot. But with the migration issue, that's like a prudential thing, right? Like we can't really argue about pro-life. We are pro-life, like that is. But should Donald Trump be exacting this in a prudential? That is like more to where the controversy could be, right? So yeah, I just wanted to point that out. There's two different things going on. I hope, Luke, I'm curious. Okay, I know this is your show, but I have a question for you. Who do you want? Who do you want to be pope?
Who do I want to be pope?
Yeah, as a Protestant. Yeah.
Well, I would like. I don't know a bunch of the. I think Pope Sarah. Pope Sarah. Maybe
hope it's prophetic.
I know. Maybe I'm being prophetic. I would love. I feel like, it was in the United States, the Episcopal Church, and actually also in Europe, kind of went astray, and it was the church in Africa. It was actually the archbishops in Rwanda and Nigeria, who really helped reshape American Anglicanism.
Yeah.
And one of the fastest growing denominations in the United States is the Anglican Church of North America, ACNA. And that church is growing, and it separated from the Episcopal Church in the United States. The Anglican Church also claims apostolic succession. And so they had to find a way. How do we get to, how do we retain apostolic succession? They chose to come under, here's these bishops in the United States and church leaders and, rectors and heads of churches who came under the Archbishop of Nigeria or Ghana or Rwanda and submitted to them. And so you had basically, I went to a church in Falls Church that was, I think, under the Church of Nigeria or something like that. Whereas that's where the authority came. And so I think you have a very strong, I would love to see an African Pope. I mean, Pope Francis obviously was the first Pope from South America, or Latin America. And so, maybe it's go from pivot from Europe to foreign continent and then back to back to Europe again, so it couldn't go in that direction. But Sarah is the one that comes to mind. I just have seen he seems to be very clear-minded and clear on his positions. Mm-hmm. So that's really the only one that I'm thinking about right now. But I have. I'll
only need one. We only need one.
It's true. I know, but the thing is, it'll be a very interesting, conclave. It'll be very interesting. I look forward to the intrigue, if you will, watching for the smoke.
We'll have Philos watch party teams.
Exactly. No, but I guess the part of it is. I think what we're hitting on is there is this disconnect between what is drawing people into the church and the church. I mean, the Catholic Church still around the world in terms of its overall numbers is declining, but in places where that have already transitioned from that decline is happening in a lot of places where they're still in a post-Christian trajectory.
Yeah.
Whereas in the United States, in a lot of places in the United States, particularly in the Northeast or the Northwest, places where it's been post-Christian for perhaps even a generation already, that's where you're seeing this sudden like resurgence of like, you know, a traditional Catholic orientation. And so I wonder how, again, and we've already kind of gone around this bush once or twice, but I do think that the next pope will still play an important role in that, because like I think about myself. I mean, I got some, you know, it's for all, you know, so that I can get lots of mail coming and lots of comments. The thing that keeps me from crossing the Tiber is Mary. I just can't, like, I just can't do Mary.
Start doing some rosaries for you.
Whatever. Yeah, sure. But you know, there's been lots of attempts to get me over this hurdle.
I know,
but I would say that like a conservative pope would have made the transition easier, right? Because at the end of the day, like I do think that I am submitting, like, you know, I would have never joined the Episcopal Church because I don't think the leader of the Episcopal Church is reflecting the teachings of the Bible. You know, you know, same thing with a bunch of the mainline denominations, and where you have that kind of a head of a church. To me, I look at that person, is that person moving the church in a way that's consistent with the teachings of Scripture or not? Right? Like, and if they're not, then that's kind of a red flag for me. I would, like, you know, not to be insulting, but there was a point in which I would be like, man, Pope Francis sure seems like the Catholic equivalent of, you know, the head of the Episcopal Church in America. Just kind of like not quite so sure about, you know, like, you know, everybody gets saved. All roads lead to God kind of stuff, right? Like there's a point in which you're like, no, actually not. Because it's not.
And it's interesting because for me, when I was in my middle of my Protestant Catholic discernment, being a Catholic gives me peace because of bad popes. And I'm not saying he's a bad pope, but let's just say, right? Or an unclear, because I was teaching high school when he, you know, during his papacy. And it's not easy to say, hey, kids, respect the Holy Father. He's your father. He's, you know, but then also bringing up the things you bringing up, Luke. And it's like, well, yeah, that's not exactly kosher either. And he's not really as clear as Pope Benedict was, or not really as poetic as JP2 was. And, you know, and then it's like, you can go off and you know, a super liberal Catholic can take what he says and run with it. And you're like, well, that's not exactly Catholic either, because, you know, he can preach wrongly about things, and that doesn't change Catholic Church teaching. So for me, it's like, not that it's not important, because you're right. Like, what his power, his influence, his public prestige, it matters. You know, most people are going to sit and do theology all the time, but, you know, do you know what I mean? Like, it just.
No, I do. I want to get to, you know, the relationship that Pope Francis had with both Jews and Israel, right? Like it's I mean, that's our kind of secret, our special focus here at the Philos Project. I mean, there's issues all over America and all over the world, but like, you know, at the end of the day, you know, our contribution to the conversation is, you know, how does it impact Israel and the Jewish people? And one of the things that Francis was quite, you know, I'm curious. I'll start with you, Phil. What do you think? I mean, when you think about Pope Francis's relationship, how would you describe it?
I think, you know, a lot of his legacy has now going to be colored by remarks he made in the aftermath of October 7th in relation to the war. There seemed, at least how I think me and my friends interpreted some messages coming out of the Vatican, seemed to have been, you know, maybe some both sidesing of the issues and then probably leaning in a bit towards, Israel is in the wrong here. To be completely frank and honest, I'm not so sure that I actually knew about anything that Pope Francis did in relation to Jewish-Christian relations, before October 7th. And again, I haven't been in the space for long enough to have really kept track. But I will say that, in terms of looking forward to the next Pope, I think any new Pope not only has to be an intellectual giant, because I think that an intellectual giant will meet the needs of the young people, but also will be able to kind of go further and build off of Nostra Aetate and the work of Pope John Paul II. And I think to do that in a theologically sound way without resorting to politics, which is, I think, how Pope Francis's legacy with Jews and Christians will be remembered, as being a political one as opposed to a theological one. So I think that shift ought to change in any future papacy. I don't know who is fit for the job, but I think that's what I would like to see, and that's how I think his legacy with Jews and Christians might be remembered.
Yeah, we're spending, unfortunately, a good bit of time these days arguing with these, traditional Latin Mass who come out somewhat aggressively against Israel and the Jewish people, it seems. Candace Owens is one, but she's not alone. I mean, I have, I regularly kind of kick the hornet's nest with these guys who come at me on X, just really because I just find it so entertaining. It's terrible that I find it so entertaining, but I also kind of want to see what sting is in those bees when I kick it,
Right.
who's going to come at me. And there is still this strong anti-Semitic, anti-Israel sentiment, it seems, and it seems to be growing in certain circles. And how do you think, what does the next Pope have to do, or can he do anything to kind of address that?
I mean, I was very happy about how strongly Pope Francis came out against anti-Semitism. I mean, he was very much in line with John Paul II and Pope Benedict on that. I mean, they were all very consistent voices against anti-Semitism. I agree with you, Phil, that unfortunately, maybe most of the Catholic Church wasn't paying attention to keffiyeh wrapped Jesus, but we certainly were, and that was not good. And then his book on hope and, investigations into genocidal claims on Israel was a huge, huge setback and disappointment in terms of Jewish Catholic relations. And again, I mean, his Easter message, he called for the release of the hostages. Excellent. But, I would say the best thing for the church, I would agree with you. I vote Cardinal Sarah. Okay, let's just say, because we need Catholic fundamentalists, because I actually think the, self-identified traditional Latin masters who swim in some anti-Semitic waters, and these people we talk to, Luke, I don't think they're traditional at all. I think they're actually very modernist, because they have made themselves their own infallible measuring rod, which is the exact opposite of Catholicism. You submit to authority. And guess what? The magisterium has spoken on this, right? Vatican has relations with Israel. So if a trustworthy, at least to the growing traditional demographic, Pope gets elected, like Cardinal Sarah, who's very intellectual and very clear, right? No confusing, ambiguous language that anybody can use for their own political purposes. Then reminds everyone that we're in the midst of implementing the Second Vatican Council, that we're in the midst of implementing Nostra Aetate. We're in the midst of implementing a theology of the laity, which is that everyone is called to be a strong Christian and to be in relationship with our Jewish brothers and sisters and to be in relationship with our Eastern Christians and with our Protestant. If I need that conservative Pope, we want to use a label, to remind everybody that conservative Pope is also pro-Vatican II, because to be Catholic is to be pro-Vatican II, and to be Catholic is to be very clear that the traditional teaching of the church is anti-Semitism is a sin. going to hell.
Right.
You can't be anti-Semitic. Sorry, that's just not a Christian Catholic thing. And even if you say that you're not anti-Semitic, but you are fostering through your social media, through your YouTube videos, through your, oh, Luke looks too Jewish, and Simone must be Jewish, and she, whatever the weird stuff we get. If you're fostering any kind of spirit that is creating anti-Judaic spirit, anti-Jewish spirit, that is not the spirit of God. And that's certainly not the authentic spirit of the council of the Holy Spirit. And the best thing that can happen for us is to have that kind of Pope, who can speak to us in that way, to remind us what we're in the middle of, which I think, Phil, you also really pointed out, we've been distracted by politics, and it's time to get back to theology.
Yeah, and that's why, I think, I don't, you both probably know better than me. I don't know whether or not Cardinal Dolan actually has a shot at becoming Pope, but his essay in the Free Press condemning anti-Semitism and getting a little bit into the theology, and of course a lot of it was Nostra Aetate. But I think as a Jewish person, that something akin to that coming from a new Pope who can do it with wisdom and clarity and a breadth of knowledge would be refreshing to I think Jews across the world. And I see the same comments that Luke is referring to. We all do. And a new Pope will be courageous if he's willing to go after those claims that people just kind of wave in front of Jews like myself and in front of Catholics like Simone. I think that would be courageous and frankly a necessary step.
So one of the challenges I'd love to kind of get your take on how this kind of gets unpacked with kind of Jewish circles, potentially or specifically, is Pope Francis and a lot of Christian leaders have simultaneously called for the release of the hostages and also for a ceasefire. And you have, one of the things that is known about Pope Francis is that he called almost every day the Catholics that were living in Gaza. And there's only there's 700 Christians, maybe only 500 left at this point, because actually some did get out. Let's assume 500 Christians left in Gaza. Maybe half of them are Catholic. So 250 people, Christian Catholics, left in Gaza. And he calls them every night and says, I'm praying for you. I hope you're well. Hope you're safe. Like, for him as a spiritual leader, isn't that his obligation to say, yeah, of course I want the hostages freed and I want a ceasefire, and I want it because of those 250 people. In my understanding of the Catholic and Orthodox and a lot of the Apostolic Church's relationship with Israel is they don't support Israel theologically. That's just a reality, and I don't think it's going to change even with the next Pope. But it doesn't mean that there's necessarily has to be an antagonism, right? Like lots of Christian denominations don't support Israel theologically, yet their members support Israel and Jews just fine. And there is a distinction often between, and I think this is pretty clear actually within a lot of the Catholic teaching, is they're very specific about the role of Jews, but they're not going to come out in support of Israel as a state. They don't really like to support states in general. It seems that would be my observation. Again, I'm not Catholic, but like the states as in countries, but peoples, they're totally fine talking about. So it is a lot on Jews, not a lot on Israel as a state. The relationship is complicated, but again, it's complicated because to some degree, his obligation is to his members, his church members, and not just the ones that are in Gaza, but the ones that are in Judea and Samaria, the ones that are in Jordan, the ones that are in Lebanon and Iraq and Syria and Iran. And there are Catholics all throughout the Middle East, all of which would potentially suffer if the new Pope came out in any way in support of Israel, because they would be seen as collaborators, they're traitors to their nation, that kind of thing. How does that does that play out, or at all? Is it, or I'm thinking about this way deeper than just any Jew ever thought. Like,
I think I think the one thing that you touched on, which was confusing, I think to a lot of my Jewish friends, and to me, I guess with my interest in training in military strategy, is he was calling for the release of the hostages and that they should be let go, which is great, but then simultaneously calling for a ceasefire when Israel is probably adhering to Christian just war theory, probably better than any modern campaign that at least I can think of. That to me was a bit strange. I mean, just war theory is the product of the church fathers, developed across a very long time, and this I think strange way that he came out on this war, that we should call for a ceasefire, which would enable this group, Hamas, to continue to pose a threat to the constituents that you're trying to care about. It was, I think, just to use a euphemism, a strange strategic choice to make. I recognize, of course, and you mentioned this, Luke, the very complicated politics of being a Catholic in the Middle East and aligning yourself with Israel in some way. And this, of course, I think this story has been written about the Latin Patriarch in particular, about just the complicated diplomatic relations that one has to have as a Catholic in the Middle East. But I think, to at least myself, I'll speak personally, it was confusing to hear calls for a ceasefire when, if anything, strong support for Israel's just war, and it is a just war by Christian just war theory, which continues to seek the destruction of the group oppressing Catholics in the Middle East, who poses the greatest threat to Christians in the region, was quite disheartening.
But don't you think, though, that, like, I mean, what you're asking for is an intellectual conversation, and in a sense, and this is where he seemed to always kind of pivot, was towards a more pastoral orientation. I mean, it's like, it is true that you can have that Israel is acting in accordance with just war theory and tradition, and I would love, capital LOVE, love, a strong re-endorsement, because it would really, I mean, it would help in so many areas where Christians have become just so unsmart in relation to the problem of war and how to think about it. Mm-hmm. As if we're going to somehow get away from it, right? Like, so, it is a reality of the world. And so, there is an intellectual tradition to be had, but then, he wasn't, didn't seem to be his priority almost very often, right? He seemed to often then pivot to that actual mercy. I'm actually concerned about the 250 Catholics sitting in Gaza right now.
Yeah, because I think there's one thing, I thought it was very beautiful that he would call the Holy Family Church in Gaza every night and be a father to them. I think that's very lovely, very moving, and that is very genuinely pastoral. Was not pastoral is, I don't think being unintellectual is pastoral, So there's like authentic pastoral that's helpful. Call the church that's suffering because Hamas terrorists have made their lives a living hell. Hamas terrorists have made their lives a living hell. Right. I'm going to call them. I'm their dad. And then throwing out things like ceasefire and all that without marrying it to everything Phil said about the truth of just war. To me, it's not pastoral. And it's why I brought up the confusion part, that, this need for clarity that made, again, may his soul rest in peace and God forgive me, but my life as a Catholic educator to high school students who are not stupid, saying, how am I supposed to understand this? And putting me in a really difficult position. Well, guys, dad's not always right about stuff, but be respectful and have a spirit of humility and not triumphalism, and don't make yourself an infallible measuring rod, but also give the church the benefit of the doubt. But also the fun part about being Catholic is we have a document that talks about how you can disagree with the Pope and the magisterium when they do go wrong, which they have. So,
Well, let me speak to another issue, because I think part of it, again, this is where we're intersecting between kind of the Catholic Israel Jewish kind of space, is that you had over the weekend with Good Friday and Easter, every year the churches say to the municipality of Jerusalem, please only allow a certain number of people to come in the Church of Holy Sepulchre. It's a building. It only fits a certain number of people safely. And every year there's a letter sent to the municipality, please protect, limit the number of people who have access. And then every year there's some dude standing at the line. He can't get in. And he's like, well, see, it's persecution. The Jews hate Easter. Like, it's a very frustrating thing to watch, because even this year the nuncio was not, he showed up late. He didn't get in. Sorry, that it's only like they only let 1,000 in or whatever. It's because it's unsafe, and it's actually Jerusalem doing its duty to protect the people who are in the city and who want to go to this event. And the ones that were early, they got in. The ones that were late, they didn't get in. But it wasn't persecution. But it's that kind of, this, probably the most frustrating part of that relationship is when Bibi Netanyahu and the Israeli government said, hey, Christians in Syria, if you need a safe place to go, head south. We have a security area. We'll keep you safe. None of the patriarchs of the Orthodox, the Catholic, any of them said anything publicly. Anytime Israel does anything wrong, like, they're instantly on the, like, they didn't come out. They asked for the limitation on the number of people in Church of Holy Sepulchre. And when the claims of persecution come, they're silent. They have no, they don't, it's like, they don't help the relationship by being honest in how it's, how the sausage is made in the Middle East between these communities, right? And so like, part of it to me is, I don't know that, whatever future pope plays a role in any of this. I mean, Cardinal Pizzabella, I love saying his name because it's super fun, rolls off the tongue. But Pizzabella, he opened up. After October 7th, when Israelis couldn't live on the border with Lebanon, he opened up the Catholic churches and the Catholic, places where people could stay. I don't know what those words are, for internally displaced people within the Israel community. Okay. Which was a really, it was a sweet message when Pizzabella offered himself in exchange for the hostages. Beautiful picture to me. But when there's these moments like this where, like, Israel, thank you for, letting Christians, be protected by you. It's silence. It's like crickets. They only get, it's only critical all the time. You never get a public affirmation of thank you, which to me is the gratitude, I feel like, would go a long way, right? I mean, wouldn't it, Phil? But
but something, Luke, it requires something more than gratitude, which is actually, I think, often the most missing component of all diplomacy everywhere in all of world history, which is courage. And I think the most successful diplomats have been the most courageous diplomats. And in a very real way, the church functions in a diplomatic role as it looks to protect its people across the world. And you're seeing a lot of these diplomatic moves, of protecting the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, opening Christian community centers. And I just think that the next step is the courage to say thank you directed where it belongs, to come out and say this wasn't persecution, this is an OSHA violation, equivalent, and it's that next step.
Yeah, I was going to say the spirit of fear is so much an oppressive spirit, demonic spirit in the Middle East, and even now in the West as Christians, with my Egyptian family, I'm like, listen, if we're giving you a spirit of fear, that's not a spirit of God. It's not a spirit of Christ. So I'm first of all, I'm really glad, Luke, that you brought up those examples, because they're everywhere and they're very frustrating. And then Phil mentioning the need for the virtue of courage, something that's bringing me consolation, because, I work with the two of you, so we know how hard this is. Especially with all these very it can really wear on you, and and I think something that has been consoling my heart in this last year has been the spirit of truth that Jesus promises the apostles 5 times in the Last Supper discourse, the spirit of truth. And when I get frustrated, the 5 paraclete promises, and when I get frustrated about all of the bad propaganda, the media, all the things you were talking about, Luke, I just ask the spirit of truth that Jesus promised to overshadow the world and overshadow these people, because it just feels so hopeless sometimes, so that's my spiritual consolation. So,
well, we'll wrap up here, but how is it? I guess my final question here is, and you have all kind of stated it in some ways, but what's your like, let's say where do you see the church 5 years from now, in relation to America, but also relation to Israel and Jewish people?
Do you want to go first, Phil?
Yeah, I know. I think it is a net good to have more religious people than less. And I sometimes wish, governments told me less about not eating sugar and not smoking, and more about going to synagogue and going to church, because those are the things that make a society healthy. That's what makes us as body and soul healthy. And so I hope that the church can meet the moment and continue to encourage its constituents to further their faith and to become more devout people. I think that's a net good for the world. And then as an Orthodox Jew, I hope that we can continue to make progress in Jewish-Christian relations. There is still a lot more work to be done. And I don't know that I'll hold the mantle for his biggest fan, because there are plenty of big fans of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks out there. But, I want to see another pope welcome another equivalent of Jonathan Sacks back into his life, and to continue doing that very holy work of just, theological truth, and between Jews and Christians. So that's what I'm hoping for. And, I think Christians believe that the Holy Spirit doesn't err, but the College of Cardinals probably can. But I hope that nevertheless, that a good, courageous, intellectual pope is picked, and that good fruit come from a new papacy.
Yeah, I pray for that too. And Luke, you mentioned that theological Zionism for Catholics isn't going to be a thing, and I just want to challenge that, because even though it is a minority of minority movements, and you're probably right, but I think if we get Catholics to read their Bibles, maybe there's a shot at that. There's enough reasons to be a Catholic Zionist without the land covenant theology, that's more easily digestible in evangelical world, but it still exists in the Catholic world. And who knows, maybe if we could take up Pope Benedict's call to be prophetic about this, that we can get there. I like to think big, but I just hope we can get out of a reactive church. You know, it was so much silliness in the 60s and 70s, especially in the American Catholic Church, that it's not surprising that people swing to the other extreme, and we want people to be traditional. Obviously, that's what it means to be Catholic, but we also need to like just be normal, just absolutely normal, and not get stuck into these extremes of rigorism and moralism on the one hand, or silliness and sentimentality on the other. Just your daily walk with Jesus and following your own personal vocation in the church and in the world. And I think that's my hope, that we can actually start to see the good fruits more dramatically of the call to communio that the Second Vatican Council was calling for.
Yeah, that's both very, very good points. And I think if the right Pope is chosen, I think you'll see the increase will continue. It is interesting that for the first time in I think something like 660 years, there's neither a Pope nor an Archbishop of Canterbury. And so it's a very interesting moment that we're in. And the Archbishop is obviously the kind of one of the kind of leaders, I guess, of the Protestant church in the world. And so you have this, you have a strange moment we're in right now. And I think, it could be on the brink of a revival. Who knows? It seems like there's, I would love to see that happen. I have no issue. I have no issue at all with with any church growing. I really don't. And if people are finding a relationship with God through the Roman Catholic Church, good on you. And if that's what it takes to get them excited about reading the Bible and going deeper, more power to them. I would love, LOVE again, love for them to see the sheer Jewishness of the story, mm-hmm. and to use that understanding of the Jewishness of the Gospels as a way to build bridges with our Jewish friends and neighbors. I think there's nothing that would strengthen the church more than to have good relationships with Jews in Israel. So that's my take. And thanks for coming, Simone, Rizkallah, and Phil Dolitsky. Thank you very much for joining me today on my show. And for those who are watching, thanks again for following us to the end, and like and subscribe. And also give. We do great work here at the Philos Project, and we do it out of support from people who are watching this show and like you. So thanks for those who do give as a result of watching this. And those giving links will be in the bio and all that sort of stuff. So thank you very much for joining me today. And until next time.
Thanks, Luke.